They told you this story was buried, that Eleanor Whitmore never existed, or that her name was lost in parish dust. But I'm about to tell you what really happened in Virginia 1912. A story so grotesque, so forbidden, that even the families who profited from her silence tried to erase her from memory. Imagine a 15-year-old girl, bound not by ribbons of youth, but by the ink of a contract. Her childhood sold to pay a father's debt. She walked into her wedding not as a bride, but as livestock led to slaughter. The bells that tolled for her union were not bells of joy. They were funeral bells for her innocence. And here is the part you were never supposed to hear. Her husband did not simply neglect her. He paraded her humiliation as if it were theater, a spectacle of domination performed before neighbors, creditors, and kin. The girl they called the ghost wife would one day become the widow who destroyed him. But not with poison, not with fire, with something far darker. A revenge born of silence, sharpened by humiliation and delivered with precision no man could see coming. This is not a love story. This is not even a tragedy. This is a ledger of power, a descent into psychological cruelty, institutional corruption, and the revenge of a child bride who learned the system that crushed her and turned it back against her tormentor. You were never meant to hear this. You were never meant to know her name. But once you do, you cannot forget it. Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of Virginia, the child bride who made the world pay. It began, as corruption always does, with a man who mistook his vice for destiny. John Whitmore of Virginia was no patriarch of honor, no farmer of steady hand. He was a gambler, a man who believed chance was more loyal than his blood. And in the smoky corners of taverns, he wagered not only his coin, but the very foundation of his family. By the winter of 1912, his debts towered higher than the roof beams of his collapsing house. His name was a stain whispered in parlors, and his creditors circled like vultures. And when the debt came due, John Whitmore discovered the oldest, cruelest currency in human history. His daughter, 15 years old. By law, a child. By society, a commodity. He signed her future away in the back office of a county solicitor, a flickering lantern casting shadows across the paper as if the devil himself watched. The witnesses recorded his trembling hand, though no one could say whether it was shame, fear, or the final tremor of a man who had bartered his soul. Her husband-to-be was Edmund Blackwell, a man nearly twice her age. His estate was faltering, his reputation dimming, but the acquisition of a Whitmore daughter, no matter how fragile or plain, meant control. For him, it was less a marriage than an acquisition, a girl as property, a house as territory, her silence as proof of his dominance. Eleanor was not present at the signing. She did not even know the paper existed. On that night she slept in her narrow bed, the remnants of childhood still clinging to her like the fading glow of a candle. She had no idea that while she dreamed, men decided she was no longer a daughter, but an object transferred. In the eyes of law and society, she had already ceased to exist as her own. This is how power works, not through open violence, but through signatures, through ceremonies, through rituals that dress exploitation in robes of legitimacy. And in that moment, the Whitmore's shame became Eleanor's sentence. A childhood ended without ceremony, not by death, not by illness, but by transaction. The church stood at the edge of the village, whitewashed walls and tall windows that caught the morning sun, but inside the air was heavy, suffocating, as if the rafters themselves knew the sin about to be sanctified. 15-year-old Eleanor's frame was slight, her dress borrowed from an older cousin, pinned and stitched to fit a child who could not fill its fabric. Lace hung from her shoulders like a costume too large for the actor forced to wear it. The bells rang as they always did for a wedding, but the sound carried no joy. To those who listened closely, it was the hollow peal of a funeral toll, announcing not a union but a burial. The burial of a girl's youth. Neighbors filled the pews, some whispering in pity, others in envy, for Edmund Blackwell was still a man of means, and a Whitmore daughter, even bartered, gave him new standing. Few questioned the age, fewer still the shame. Respectability, after all, was built on silence. Eleanor walked the aisle, not with the steps of a bride, but with the gait of a prisoner approaching the gallows. Her eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards, each step echoing like a hammer sealing her fate. The congregation watched, their faces a blend of curiosity and complicity, as if her humiliation were theatre, and they its paying audience. Edmund Blackwell stood at the altar, stiff-backed and satisfied, a man who saw himself not as a groom, but as a conqueror. His smile was not affection, it was ownership. When he took Eleanor's trembling hand, the room exhaled in approval, not compassion. The priest read the vows, the words of sacred union, but to Eleanor they sounded like iron bars clanging shut. When the kiss was demanded, she flinched, a child's body recoiling from a ritual she could neither comprehend nor refuse. Laughter rippled through the pews, the sound slicing deeper than the vows themselves. That laughter would haunt her. It would burn inside her, a scar not visible on her skin, but carved into her memory. And so the ceremony ended, papers signed, vows spoken, bells rung, a transaction complete, masked as a holy union. But beneath the veil of ritual, something darker took root. Humiliation had been planted like a seed in Eleanor's soul, and one day it would bloom, not as submission, but as vengeance. The ceremony was over. The congregation dispersed. The bells fell silent. But the true weight of Eleanor's fate began not in the church, but in the chambers of Blackwell's estate. A room that smelt of damp wood and iron, its velvet curtains heavy as prison walls. She was led there like an offering, her small hands clutching the frayed hem of her gown, the lace already stained by the dirt of the road. Edmund Blackwell, her husband and her master, dismissed the servants with a flick of his hand, locking the door with deliberate finality. The sound of the latch echoed louder than the wedding bells. For Eleanor, it was the sound of captivity. There was no tenderness in what followed, no affection, no patience, only the cold precision of a man enacting ownership. He paraded her fragility as proof of his dominance, stripping not only her body of protection, but her soul of sanctuary. And when she resisted, as any child would, he did not rage, he laughed. That laughter, sharper than any blow, would etch itself into her memory, carving humiliation into bone. Outside, the estate slept, unaware or unwilling to know what horrors unfolded behind locked doors. To the villagers, Eleanor was now Mrs. Blackwell, elevated from poverty into respectability, but in truth, she was a prisoner, caged not in iron, but in expectation, her cries muffled by the walls of silence that society had built for centuries. And yet, in that silence, something awoke. A spark. Eleanor did not understand it then, not fully, but she felt it stir inside her. The seed planted at the altar now watered by cruelty. She would not forget the laughter. She would not forgive the humiliation. She could not escape, not yet. But in time, she would learn to wait, to endure, to sharpen her silence into a blade her captor would never see coming. That night, innocence died, but something else was born. Something older, harder, and more enduring than pain. The girl they called the ghost wife was beginning to take shape. Blackwell's estate was no home. It was a theatre of humiliation, a stage where Eleanor's suffering became performance. Each day followed a rhythm designed not for comfort, but for control. The child who once chased fireflies in Virginia fields now carried water jugs too heavy for her small frame, scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, and served meals at a table where she herself was forbidden to sit. Blackwell relished this. He paraded her before guests as if she were a curiosity. "My little bride," he would say, laughter curling in his throat like smoke. Men chuckled, women whispered, and Eleanor stood silent, her cheeks burning, her eyes lowered, while the sound of their amusement seared itself into her flesh. In silence, humiliation becomes memory, and memory becomes weapon. Her childhood disappeared not in a single blow but in fragments stolen daily. Her toys vanished, her books locked away. Her hair, once tied with ribbons by her mother, now bound tightly in the severe bun demanded of a wife, every trace of girlhood erased. She was forced to sit in sewing circles with women twice her age, enduring their mocking smiles, their pitying glances. To them she was not a peer, but a spectacle, a cautionary tale draped in lace. Yet Eleanor learned. She watched. She listened. While her husband and his friends drank brandy by the fire, she lingered in the shadows, hearing secrets never meant for her ears, debts disguised as triumphs, schemes whispered like confessions. She learned the language of men who believed women deaf. She studied the patterns of power, how it flowed, how it faltered, how it could be turned back against its wielder. Each day was humiliation, yes, but each day also carved her sharper, harder, quieter. In her silence she built a fortress. In her endurance she forged a blade. Blackwell thought he had broken her. In truth, he was creating the very weapon that would one day undo him. Eleanor's prison had no bars. It did not need them. Its walls were made of expectation, its locks forged from silence. To the villagers, she was the dutiful young wife, a curiosity perhaps, but nothing more. They saw her lowered eyes, her bowed head, and mistook submission for contentment. No one asked. No one interfered. Respectability demanded blindness. Her letters home were censored before they reached her hands. What few she wrote were dictated by Blackwell, signed with the trembling obedience he required. Even her mother's replies carried only platitudes. Be a good wife. Honor your husband. Patience is a woman's virtue. In this way, family became another accomplice to her captivity. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Eleanor was not allowed to wander beyond the estate without supervision. The world outside became distant, like a landscape seen through glass. Her only companions were the servants, themselves bound by fear. They spoke little, their silence mirroring her own, their eyes flickering with pity that never became action. Yet in isolation, Eleanor discovered something powerful. Silence, she realized, could serve two masters. To Blackwell it was obedience. To Eleanor, it was disguise. Beneath her quiet gaze, she concealed a growing awareness, a cold clarity. She began to move like shadow, unseen, unheard, but always watching. She studied her husband as a prisoner studies a jailer. His habits, his weaknesses, the way his hand shook after too much brandy, the ledgers he guarded more fiercely than his marriage bed. She noticed how his voice faltered when creditors pressed, how he smoothed over lies with laughter, how his pride was both armor and wound. The villagers saw a silent, broken child. Blackwell saw a compliant wife, but neither saw what Eleanor was becoming, a patient architect of her own vengeance. Her silence was no longer prison alone. It was mask. It was shield. It was the crucible in which something far more dangerous was being forged. In the stillness of her isolation, Eleanor was sharpening. It began with something so small no one noticed. Not Blackwell, not the servants, not even the villagers who whispered about her behind church pews. But for Eleanor, it was the first crack in the wall of obedience. One evening, as Blackwell dozed in his chair, brandy glass slipping in his hand, his ledger sat open on the desk beside him. That ledger was his lifeblood, debts disguised as wealth, schemes balanced on lies. Eleanor had seen him clutch it tighter than her own arm, guarding it as though it contained scripture. And that night, when his snores rattled the silence, she stepped closer. Her hands trembled at first, the way they had on her wedding day. But she steadied them. She turned the pages one by one, the ink glowing faintly in the lamplight. Numbers she did not yet fully understand, names of creditors, false accounts. But she studied them, committing them to memory as if each figure were a weapon. When Blackwell stirred, she closed the book softly and returned to her place by the hearth, face blank, eyes lowered. It was nothing more than a glance at ink on paper. Yet it was everything. A child bride had peered into the machinery of a man's power, and she had not been caught. From then on, she began to test the edges of her prison. She hid small scraps of bread in her apron when Blackwell wasn't looking, slipping them to the kitchen maid who was too thin to stand straight. She let a servant rest longer than allowed, covering for her when footsteps approached. These were tiny rebellions, invisible to all but her. But each act whispered the same truth. She was not broken. Defiance, Eleanor discovered, did not always roar. Sometimes it was a whisper, a glance, a secret carried silently in the chest. She learned that power could be stolen in fragments gathered slowly until one day it was enough to cut through chains. Blackwell still paraded her humiliation, believing she was nothing but a ghost in lace. But beneath her silence, Eleanor was no longer merely enduring. She was beginning to plot. Edmund Blackwell had grown arrogant in his cruelty. Private torment was no longer enough. He wanted spectacle. To him, Eleanor was not only wife but trophy, proof of his dominance over debt, over whispers, over the very notion of pity. And so he began to display her suffering like a prized possession. At gatherings in his estate, he would force her to serve guests, balancing trays heavier than her arms could bear, watching her stumble while men laughed and women smirked behind gloved hands. He called her my little bride in front of them, his tone dripping with mockery, and when her face flushed with shame, he leaned closer, whispering words designed not to be heard by others. "They see what I see, a child who cannot even stand without trembling." Once, during a dinner, he demanded she play the piano, though she had never been taught. As her fingers struck clumsy notes, discordant and halting, the room erupted in laughter. Blackwell smiled broadly, soaking in their amusement, as if her humiliation were wine to be poured generously. Eleanor sat stiff at the bench, her cheeks burning, her chest tight. But her eyes, lowered though they were, caught everything. Who laughed loudest? Who looked away in discomfort? Who whispered behind fans? Every detail was stored, every cruelty catalogued. The humiliation was constant, designed to crush her spirit. But instead of breaking, Eleanor learned, she discovered that shame, endured long enough, becomes fuel. That silence, though suffocating, can harden into armor. Each jeer was another stone added to the foundation of her vengeance. She realized something more dangerous still. Blackwell's need for an audience was his weakness. His pride demanded witnesses. And pride, she began to see, was a wound that could be torn open with precision. To the room, she was still the ghost wife, a fragile figure in lace, a child playing at womanhood. But beneath that mask, Eleanor's resolve was sharpening. The laughter that once pierced her now only echoed as reminder. One day she promised herself the laughter would stop, and when it did, silence would be her victory. Whispers are a currency as dangerous as coin. Eleanor learned this in the pews of the church, in the marketplace, even in the pauses of sewing circles where needles clicked like the ticking of clocks. At first the whispers were pitying. So young, women muttered, shaking their heads as she passed, barely a bride, already a wife. But pity is fragile, easily reshaped into mockery. Soon the whispers shifted. The ghost wife, they called her. A girl swallowed by lace, too frail to speak, too silent to fight. Children mimicked her bowed walk in the street, while their mothers silenced them with nervous laughter. Respectability demanded cruelty, so long as it was spoken softly. But Eleanor listened, and in those murmurs, she discovered something her husband never noticed. Gossip had weight. A phrase repeated in enough kitchens became truth. A rumor carried from market stalls to church steps became judgment. Blackwell, drunk on his pride, dismissed it all. But Eleanor saw the fissures forming. The villagers began to question his debts, though not aloud. They noticed how creditors lingered too long at his gate, how his estate's fields bore less harvest than his boasts claimed. They whispered about the brandy that stained his breath at sermons, about the girl wife who never lifted her eyes. And in those murmurs, Eleanor saw a weapon. If cruelty could be performed in public, then revenge could be too. Not with blades, not with fire, but with words so quiet they echoed louder than screams. From that moment, Eleanor no longer dreaded the whispers. She welcomed them. For every word spoken behind her back was another thread she could weave into the noose of Blackwell's undoing. The girl once silenced had discovered the power of silence itself, not as prison, but as stage. She would not shout, she would not plead. She would let others speak for her, their voices carry it. her vengeance like wind stoking a hidden flame. And so the village, without knowing it, became her accomplice. Eleanor understood something most never learn. Survival is theatre. To endure in Blackwell's house, she had to become what they believed her to be, and so she performed her role with precision. She lowered her eyes at the exact moment he glanced her way. She flinched when he raised his voice, even if the sound did not wound her. She carried trays with trembling hands, allowed her voice to break in whispers, and folded herself into the shape of obedience. To the villagers, to the servants, even to Blackwell himself, she appeared as nothing more than the ghost wife, a child hollowed by humiliation. But behind the mask she was awake. Each tremor was rehearsed, each silence calculated. She realized that appearing broken gave her a freedom her captor could not see. Blackwell no longer watched her closely. He dismissed her as harmless, too small to threaten, too fragile to resist. His arrogance became her camouflage. By day she moved like shadow, invisible, forgettable. By night she listened. She memorized the creak of the stairs, the scrape of Blackwell's boots against stone, the way the servants whispered about unpaid wages. She learned which creditors visited and which letters made her husband's hands shake. The mask of obedience gave her access. No one guards what they believe cannot fight back. And Eleanor was patient. Patience is its own kind of weapon. She did not rush. She did not reveal herself. She allowed humiliation to pile upon her brick by brick, knowing that one day the very wall built to contain her would collapse beneath its own weight. Her silence was no longer submission. It was rehearsal. Every bowed head, every lowered gaze, every trembling hand, all part of the performance. And behind that performance, the real Eleanor sharpened like steel hidden beneath velvet. The ghost wife was an illusion. Behind her veil of obedience, a predator waited. The estate had always been a house of masks, laughter covering debts, rituals covering shame. But one night, Eleanor pulled back the curtain. Blackwell had returned from town in a rage, slamming doors, shouting at servants, his face red from drink. He collapsed into his chair by the fire, cursing creditors under his breath. And then, with careless arrogance, he left his coat draped across the armrest, its inner pocket bulging with folded papers. Eleanor waited. She kept her eyes lowered, hands folded like the obedient ghost wife she pretended to be. Only when his snores rattled through the hall did she move. Quiet as a shadow, she slid the papers free. Inside were letters, not from friends or allies, but from creditors, demands for repayment, threats of foreclosure, warnings that his estate, his very name, teetered on collapse. He owed more than he could ever repay. He had mortgaged his lands, sold harvests not yet planted, borrowed against futures that no longer existed. As Eleanor's eyes traced each line, she felt something colder than fear: clarity. Blackwell was not untouchable, he was drowning, and the louder he laughed at dinners, the more desperately he hid the truth. His cruelty was not strength, it was panic. She tucked the letters back into place, her face blank when he stirred, her body small and still by the fire. But in her chest, something burned. For the first time since her wedding, Eleanor felt power. Fragile, yes, but real. Knowledge is sharper than any blade. And now she held the first edge of his undoing. The villagers already whispered about his debts, the creditors already circled like vultures. And Eleanor realized she would not need to kill him with her own hands. She could let his ruin devour him. All she had to do was wait, and when the cracks widened, she would be there to push. That night, the ghost wife smiled for the first time, not where anyone could see, but in the shadows where her revenge was taking root. Silence, Eleanor discovered, was not absence, it was influence. The less she spoke, the more others filled the void, spilling secrets they thought she could not use. The servants were the first. They pitied her, yes, but pity is a door easily opened. When she lingered in kitchens with downcast eyes, they whispered in her presence, assuming she was too timid to act. She learned which creditors were most ruthless, which crops had failed, which debts Blackwell hid from the world. She learned the servants had not been paid in months, their loyalty worn thin. Eleanor never argued, never asked. She only listened, nodding faintly, her silence a vessel into which they poured their frustrations. And soon, When Blackwell's voice thundered through the halls, the servants' eyes turned toward her. Not as wife, not as child, but as silent witness. They began to trust her silence. In the village, too, whispers found her. Women at sewing circles leaned close, muttering rumors, curious if she had heard more. Eleanor never confirmed, never denied. She let them wonder, and in that wondering the whispers spread further. She understood now. To deny a rumor is to kill it. To remain silent is to let it grow. Slowly, carefully, she began to guide what others believed. A lowered gaze at the mention of debts, a faint tremor when someone named a creditor, small gestures that required no words but carried heavy weight. Villagers left convinced they had uncovered something themselves, when in truth Eleanor had fed them exactly what she wished. Blackwell never noticed. To him she was still the obedient ghost wife, the child too broken to resist. But his arrogance blinded him to the truth. His own wife had become the echo chamber of his downfall, amplifying whispers into weapons, silence into strategy. What Eleanor built in those days was not rebellion, not yet. It was something subtler, more dangerous. She was weaving a net of rumor and resentment, a net her husband would walk into himself, laughing until the moment it closed around his throat. The ghost wife had found her voice, and it spoke not in shouts, but in silence. It began with small humiliations, almost invisible to those who did not look closely. A creditor's carriage lingered too long outside the estate. A letter arrived marked "Final Notice," its red wax seal broken with trembling hands. Blackwell's voice, once booming with arrogant laughter, began to falter when neighbors mentioned the harvest. The villagers noticed. They always did. Respectability in Virginia was a fragile theater, and once the paint began to peel, the audience leaned forward, eager for the show of collapse. Whispers swelled in taverns and church pews alike. Blackwell was losing his grip. His fields yielded less each season. His debts outweighed his land. His child bride was not proof of his strength, but a mask for his weakness. And Eleanor listened, always listening. At market stalls she caught fragments of conversation. The estate can't last another winter. Blackwell's borrowed against ghosts. Even his servants mutter. She did not add to the whispers. She did not need to. Her silence was confirmation enough. A single lowered gaze, a faint tightening of her lips, and the villagers left believing their suspicions were true. Inside the estate, the pressure mounted. Creditors arrived unannounced, voices raised in Blackwell's study. Servants went unpaid, their loyalty eroding into quiet resentment. Blackwell drank more heavily, slamming doors, shouting at shadows, his cruelty sharper with each failure. But the louder he raged, the more hollow his power became. And Eleanor? She remained the ghost wife, obedient, silent, invisible, yet in the quiet of her chamber she pieced the fragments together. His estate was not merely strained, it was crumbling. His debts were not merely large, they were fatal. The man who had humiliated her, paraded her suffering like theater, was now himself becoming the spectacle. For the first time she did not feel fear when his voice thundered through the halls. She felt anticipation. His ruin was no longer a distant dream, it was beginning. Eleanor had only to wait, and the cracks would widen. And when they did, she would make certain the world saw him fall. The estate, once a theater of quiet domination, became a chamber of escalating cruelty. Blackwell's failures, debts unpaid, creditors relentless, the estate's reputation waning, made him reckless. Each morning, Eleanor awoke to a new torment, a new reminder that power, untempered by wisdom, is a tyrant's greatest vulnerability. Blackwell's commands became sharper, his tone colder. Orders that had once been simple tasks now carried a ritualized sting. She scrubbed floors until her hands bled. She carried trays too heavy for her small frame. She knelt before him, delivering items with trembling arms, while he ridiculed her every movement, delighting in the spectacle of her obedience. But the cruelty was no longer merely control. It was panic, the desperation of a man who knew the walls around him were crumbling. Letters from creditors were now delivered in public view, and Blackwell snapped at every servant, every visitor, every shadow in the hall. His arrogance faltered when Eleanor appeared. He sought to reassert dominance, but the cracks in his power reflected in her eyes, sharpened and observing, unbroken in spirit, though broken in appearance. Eleanor felt the thrill of clarity in these moments. Every insult, every humiliation was a window into his weakness. Each act of cruelty was a breadcrumb she could follow, mapping the unraveling of the man who had once treated her as property. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She allowed the spectacle to continue, knowing the more he displayed his power, the more he revealed his vulnerability. Servants whispered that Blackwell had begun calling her the Shadow, mocking her presence while unknowingly confirming her strategy. Villagers, long accustomed to his authority, started to notice the subtle tremors in his control. Eleanor's silence amplified the effect. She became the mirror reflecting his chaos back at him, without lifting a hand, without uttering a word. Desperation, Eleanor realized, is a weapon when wielded against those who think it cannot touch them. Blackwell's cruelty was the clearest map to his undoing, and with each passing day, Eleanor prepared herself not as a child bride, not as a ghost, but as a woman plotting the inevitable reckoning. The seeds of vengeance had been sown. What grew from them would be unstoppable. It was a late afternoon in spring when Eleanor saw it, a small, almost imperceptible act that would change everything. A group of villagers approached the estate, ostensibly to deliver goods. Blackwell, in his habitual arrogance, barked commands, expecting immediate compliance. But one man hesitated, just a fraction of a second longer than Blackwell deemed proper. The moment was brief, almost invisible, yet it reverberated through Eleanor's perception. The man did not stumble or apologize profusely. He merely met Blackwell's glare with a quiet steadiness. The merchant's defiance, though subtle, broke the illusion of total control. Eleanor's heart raced. She had spent years observing the subtleties of power, the way fear bends the will, the way obedience can be manufactured, and yet here was proof that control is never absolute, that tyranny can falter in the face of even the smallest resistance. From her vantage point, Eleanor saw more. A woman delivering eggs, a widow who had once been silent in the village, now standing tall as Blackwell dismissed her concerns with thinly veiled threats. She did not speak loudly, did not argue, yet her calm defiance carried weight. Eleanor understood instantly. Power is as much perception as reality, and perception can be manipulated. A dangerous idea took root. Eleanor began to see herself not as a victim, not as property, but as a force that could harness these small rebellions. Each hesitation, each quiet refusal was a lever she could use. Each whisper of discontent among servants and villagers became a thread in the web she would weave. She allowed herself a thought she had forbidden for years. She could turn the tide without spilling blood. At least, not yet. Observation, patience, and strategic silence were more powerful than brute force. Blackwell's arrogance made him blind to the growing network around him, and Eleanor's position, once a cage, had become her vantage point. That day, standing in the shadowed corridors of the estate, Eleanor Whitmore understood a truth that would guide every move from that moment on. Obedience is a weapon when others wield it blindly, but awareness is an even deadlier one. Her eyes, once hollow, now burned with purpose. The spark of defiance had become a flame. Eleanor's plan did not require noise, it required precision. Every gesture, every glance, every moment of silence became a tool she wielded with deadly accuracy. She had learned to read the currents of power, to see where fear and ambition intersected. Blackwell, blinded by arrogance, could not perceive the storm forming around him. The servants were her first instruments. Whispers carefully timed, questions asked softly, hints of dissatisfaction. Eleanor planted these like seeds in fertile soil. They spread quietly, unnoticed by him, until the household itself became a conduit of tension and unease. Those who had once been loyal began to hesitate, to murmur under their breath, unsure if their mistress observed, or worse, if she approved. In the village, Eleanor's presence was a mirror. She did not speak, but her subtle observations, a slight nod, a quiet acknowledgement, the smallest flicker of attention, guided perception. Villagers began to see cracks they had not dared notice before. They reported rumors of debts, of mismanagement, of a master growing fragile under his own weight. Eleanor did not push. She only allowed them to notice what she already knew, to interpret the evidence themselves. Creditors, too, became unwitting allies. Letters delivered late, reminders sent more frequently, quiet murmurs of impatience. Eleanor observed their schedules, their impatience, the precise timing of each demand. Then, with careful silence, she allowed them to collide with Blackwell's arrogance. He fumed, dismissed some, mismanaged others, and in doing so reinforced the perception that his control was slipping. Every day, Eleanor's influence grew without her voice. Her presence alone became the fulcrum of fear and anticipation. Blackwell's power, once absolute in the estate and village, became tenuous. His authority eroded not by open rebellion, but by orchestrated perception. Each observer, each participant in the unfolding drama, believed they were acting independently, and yet they moved exactly as Eleanor intended. In the privacy of her chamber, she allowed herself a grim satisfaction. She had been a ghost, a child, an instrument of humiliation, but now she had become the architect of consequence. Blackwell's arrogance was his undoing, and she had only to wait for it to collapse, like brittle stone beneath the weight of inevitability. Eleanor had become invisible power, the quiet force bending the world around her. The silent widow was rising. It happened on a brisk autumn morning in the square where the villagers gathered for the weekly market. Blackwell arrived as always, tall, imposing, convinced that presence alone could command respect. Yet Eleanor had already positioned herself in the unseen currents of influence. Servants carried minor complaints with carefully measured hesitation. Villagers asked questions in tones that implied curiosity, not challenge. But the effect was the same. Each hesitation chipped away at the veneer of Blackwell's control. He barked commands, demanded answers, expected compliance, and found it delayed, questioned, undermined by the mere suggestion of doubt. Eleanor watched from the shadows, a slight smile touching her lips. Each pause, each falter, was a note in a symphony she conducted silently. The market-goers sensed something shifting. Authority, once monolithic, now wavered. Blackwell's gestures became sharper, his voice higher, his patience thinning visibly. Even the strongest men in the crowd began to exchange glances, whispers rolling like soft thunder across the square. The humiliation, though subtle, was complete. A trader hesitated over the price of oats. A servant misdelivered a message, timidly questioning Blackwell's insistence. Small, innocuous failures multiplied in the public eye, each reinforcing the idea that his control was no longer absolute. The villagers did not need Eleanor's intervention. They needed only to witness the cracks and interpret them for themselves. And Blackwell, blind in arrogance, blamed none of it on himself. He swore, gestured, and lashed out, but the scene only deepened the perception of weakness. Eleanor, silent, remained the calm eye in the storm. She had not raised her voice. She had not drawn attention to herself, yet she was the force guiding every misstep, every faltering gesture, every silent humiliation. By the day's end, whispers followed Blackwell back to the estate. He was no longer feared, only observed. The public performance of his authority had failed, orchestrated not through confrontation, but through patient manipulation and the unseen currents of perception Eleanor controlled. In that moment, Eleanor Whitmore ceased to be merely a victim or a ghost wife. She became the unseen power shaping the fate of the man who had once thought her powerless. The lesson was clear. Influence wielded quietly is more devastating than force displayed openly. The first cracks had appeared, and Eleanor was ready to widen them. Eleanor understood that true power is not seized through confrontation, but through the quiet erosion of loyalty. She began with those closest to Blackwell, the men and women whose allegiance he assumed unquestioned. Servants, stewards, and family confidants became subtle instruments, their perceptions carefully guided, their doubts amplified without ever needing to speak openly. A misplaced letter, a delayed message, a quietly observed error. Each was a calculated cue. Eleanor allowed servants to witness small oversights, to misinterpret intentions, and to speculate on what they saw. Fear of reprisal kept them silent, yet curiosity whispered in their ears. Eleanor had long ago learned that suspicion is the most dangerous poison a mind can carry. Once it spreads, it cannot easily be contained. Blackwell, untrained in subtlety, could only react. Every attempt to assert control was observed, catalogued, and reflected back by Eleanor with meticulous patience. His closest allies began to hesitate. Instructions were questioned, suggestions offered under the guise of concern. Blackwell's authority, once assumed absolute, was undermined by the very people he trusted to maintain it. Even minor mistakes became magnified. A steward who had once followed orders without hesitation now faltered, unsure whether obedience would be praised or punished. A maid whispered too loudly in the hall, and Blackwell's reaction only confirmed Eleanor's quiet orchestration. Authority untempered by perception is brittle, and every crack becomes a wedge. Eleanor herself remained invisible. She spoke rarely, smiled infrequently, and moved with deliberate neutrality. Yet her presence was a constant pressure, an unseen hand guiding the fractures in Blackwell's network. He did not perceive her influence, and yet every failure, every hesitation, every subtle misalignment was evidence of her growing mastery. Isolation became inevitable. Allies withdrew, uncertain of what they could trust. Blackwell, once secure in his dominance, now faced a household and village quietly aligned against him. A web of influence he could not see, orchestrated by a woman he had dismissed as powerless. In the quiet of her chamber, Eleanor contemplated the inevitability of what she had begun. Every whisper, every hesitation, every carefully timed error was a step toward reclamation. She was no longer the child bride, no longer the silent ghost. She had become the unseen architect of ruin, bending perception and loyalty to her will. The stage was set. Blackwell's collapse was imminent, and Eleanor Whitmore was ready to strike with precision. It was late morning when the creditor arrived, a man whose reputation for precision and severity in financial matters was well known throughout the county. Blackwell expected compliance, the quiet nods, the unthinking obedience that had always sustained his authority. He had not considered Eleanor's presence or her growing mastery over the currents of perception. Eleanor positioned herself with quiet intention. She did not speak immediately. She did not act overtly. Instead, she allowed small details to surface, leaving evidence of mismanagement in plain sight. Ledgers left slightly askew, receipts misfiled, servants' hesitations observed but uncorrected. Each anomaly, small in isolation, created a cumulative impression. The creditor noticed. Sharp eyes, trained to detect risk and deception, picked up the irregularities. Blackwell's attempts to explain, to assert control, only deepened the perception of incompetence. Eleanor's quiet interjections, subtle clarifications, calmly spoken observations, were measured. She presented facts without emotion, without accusation, and yet every word struck with the weight of truth. Blackwell's reaction was predictable. Flustered, defensive, trying to command respect through authority alone, he failed spectacularly. The creditor's scrutiny revealed errors, miscalculations, and neglect. Eleanor remained composed, a mirror of calm competence that made Blackwell's frustration appear all the more stark. The room grew tense, the air thick with unspoken realization. The creditor's confidence in Blackwell wavered. Subtle questions and repeated clarifications highlighted the cracks in his household and in his control. Eleanor observed carefully, each misstep, each hesitation, a note in the symphony of his unraveling. By the end of the meeting, the creditor departed with a cautious gaze, leaving Blackwell exposed and isolated. Lagers and servants who learned of the encounter whispered of Eleanor's calm demeanor, of her intelligence, and of the unerring precision with which she had highlighted Blackwell's failures. For the first time, the world outside the estate saw what Eleanor had long known. Blackwell's authority was brittle, his dominance constructed on the illusion of control. She had not raised a hand, not shouted, not demanded attention. Yet, through perception and precise revelation, she had struck a wound that would not heal easily. Eleanor Whitmore's reputation grew silently, quietly, dangerously. The widow in the shadows was no longer invisible. She was becoming the force that would redefine every hierarchy in her path. Eleanor understood that true power extended far beyond the walls of the estate. Authority is fragile when public perception turns, and she had already begun the quiet work of turning the county's eyes. She did not confront openly, she did not demand attention. Instead, she allowed observation to become her weapon, whispers to become her messengers. At gatherings, she positioned herself deliberately, silent yet present. Villagers noticed the subtle ways in which she carried herself, composed, measured, attentive. Observers reported her poise in markets, in the parish church, in the hallways of the county manor. Every movement reinforced contrast. Blackwell's bluster became more apparent, his arrogance more transparent, his authority increasingly brittle. Letters and communications became instruments in her hands. She guided what information reached influential families, what gossip traveled, what small missteps were noticed and magnified. Eleanor's interventions were invisible. Creditors, neighboring landowners and councilmen believed they were acting independently, reacting naturally to Blackwell's errors. And yet, every interpretation, every perception had been shaped, manipulated by her subtle orchestration. The effect was cumulative. Invitations once freely extended to Blackwell were now delayed, questioned, scrutinized. Friends and associates hesitated in his presence, consulting carefully with Eleanor, aware of her quiet intelligence. Allies began to drift away, unconsciously aligned not by force, but by the certainty that the balance of power had shifted. Blackwell, blinded by pride, failed to recognize the slow erosion of influence taking place around him. Eleanor's control over perception became a psychological siege. Blackwell's reputation, once a fortress, now appeared fragmented. Small errors, private frustrations, minor miscalculations, all were amplified in the social consciousness. Villagers discussed them in whispers. Neighbors exchanged observations in polite tones that carried the weight of judgment. The estate became a stage, Eleanor the unseen director, orchestrating every movement, every reaction, every interpretation. Even the clergy, long deferential to Blackwell's status, began to perceive cracks. Eleanor's quiet dignity contrasted sharply with his faltering composure. In public prayer, in social gatherings, in the most casual interactions, his authority seemed more performative than substantive, while hers appeared grounded, inevitable as the slow turn of seasons. By the close of the season, Blackwell's isolation was unmistakable. His influence, once absolute, had been corroded by perception itself, guided invisibly by Eleanor. He no longer commanded respect, he demanded it, and the county no longer complied willingly. Eleanor Whitmore had become more than the silent child bride or the hidden widow. She was now the architect of a social transformation, reshaping reality itself without a single overt act of violence, a force so subtle, so precise, that it seemed like inevitability. Inside the walls of the Blackwell estate, a new rhythm had begun, one that Blackwell could neither anticipate nor control. Eleanor had transformed silence into strategy, teaching those around her, quietly and imperceptibly, that obedience was no longer mandatory, that discretion could serve a higher purpose. Orders that once met instant compliance now faltered. A steward delayed delivering instructions, citing practical difficulties. Servants hesitated in their tasks, exchanging brief, meaningful glances. Each delay, each minor resistance, was invisible to Blackwell at first, but cumulative in its effect. He perceived only anomalies, the odd mistake, the subtle lack of urgency, and assumed incompetence. Eleanor observed each reaction, noting patterns, adjusting the cadence of her influence. She did not intervene directly. She needed only to be present, her attention a silent signal that their defiance had purpose. Servants once fearful began to experiment with small acts of autonomy. A door left unlocked just long enough for Blackwell's frustration to manifest, a task intentionally misunderstood, a whispered suggestion that challenged his authority without explicit confrontation. Blackwell's temper flared, The more he attempted to assert control, the more his household resisted, guided not by open defiance but by Eleanor's unseen hand. He was caught in a psychological trap. To punish too harshly would reveal his vulnerability. To ignore the disruptions would erode his authority further. Every command became a risk, every interaction a battlefield. The estate itself seemed to pulse with this new dynamic. The halls, once silent in their conformity, now carried subtle murmurs. The servants' movements were measured, deliberate, synchronized with Eleanor's quiet guidance. Blackwell's presence, once commanding, now drew uncertainty and hesitation. His instructions lay housed in a web of cultivated perception. Even the smallest gestures were now weapons. A mislaid item, a slight pause before obedience, a murmured clarification. All amplified Blackwell's growing insecurity. Eleanor's influence extended beyond her visible actions. It had entered the minds of those who served him, shaping reality through suggestion and perception. By the end of the week, the estate had shifted. Authority no longer radiated from Blackwell. It flowed through Eleanor. She had not raised her voice, not demanded attention, not sought retribution. Yet every corner of the house, every servant, every movement had become an extension of her will. Blackwell, trapped in the illusion of control, faced the undeniable truth. The child bride he had dismissed, the ghost he had ignored, now held dominion over the very household he claimed to own. The stage was set for the next move. Eleanor Whitmore's orchestration had only just begun. The autumn fair arrived in Ashbourne, a gathering that drew the eyes of every notable family in the county. Blackwell, confident in his social dominance, arrived with a mixture of pride and expectation. He assumed the familiar rhythm, deference, politeness, whispered admiration. What he did not anticipate was Eleanor's orchestration, a plan executed with precision, invisible yet unmistakable in its effect. Eleanor positioned herself carefully, appearing to follow the routines of the day, a figure of quiet composure among the bustling crowd. But every glance she cast, every nod she allowed, was calculated. She understood the art of subtle influence. Perception could be manipulated without overt action, reality reshaped through suggestion. Servants, neighbors, and acquaintances had already been primed. Conversations intentionally overheard painted Blackwell as inattentive, arrogant, and increasingly irrelevant. The first moment of disruption was almost imperceptible. A servant, guided by Eleanor's silent signal, allowed a miscommunication to reach Blackwell's attention. A detail overlooked, a schedule mismanaged. He responded with authority, sharp and public, and Eleanor let it unfold. Every eye witnessed his irritation, his command faltering under the weight of minor errors that magnified his flaws. As the day progressed, Eleanor allowed small truths to surface. She asked questions, appearing curious and innocent, revealing the neglect, the mismanagement, the incompetence that Blackwell could not hide. The effect was devastating. Friends and peers began to doubt, their respect shifting subtly but irreversibly. Blackwell's authority, which had seemed unassailable, crumbled in quiet stages, observed by every attendee. By mid-afternoon, whispers spread through the fairgrounds. Observers noted his impatience, his failure to maintain control, the contrast between his flustered demeanor and Eleanor's composed presence. The child bride, once invisible and powerless, now radiated a quiet command that reshaped the social hierarchy. Blackwell's arrogance, previously a shield, had become a mark of vulnerability. Eleanor's strategy was psychological precision at its finest. No accusations were made, no dramatic gestures executed. Yet the humiliation was total. County leaders, creditors, and neighbors left the fair unconsciously aligned, aware that Blackwell's dominance had faltered, aware that Eleanor's influence had grown undeniable. As the sun set over Ashbourne, the shift was clear. Blackwell returned to the estate, defeated not by violence, but by perception itself. Eleanor Whitmore had cemented her power publicly and irreversibly. She had demonstrated the truth every man fears: control is fragile, reputation is mortal, and a quiet mind, wielded strategically, can topple empires built on pride and ignorance. The stage was now set for the final transformation. Eleanor's next steps would ensure that Blackwell's authority would never recover, and that her own dominion would extend far beyond the walls of the estate. The winter of Ashbourne arrived with frost biting through every corridor of the Blackwell estate, but it was Eleanor who wielded the coldest power. Blackwell, once a man of unquestioned authority, now trembled in the shadow of a child he had once deemed inconsequential. The transformation was not sudden, but inevitable, calculated, deliberate, and absolute. Eleanor understood the human psyche as few ever would. Control is rarely seized by force. It is embedded, suggested, internalized. She spoke rarely, but every word cut through Blackwell's armor. Every glance, every subtle motion conveyed supremacy without threat, dominance without exposure. She no longer obeyed. She instructed subtly with precision that forced compliance without overt confrontation. The estate itself became an extension of her will. Tasks once assigned by Blackwell were rerouted through Eleanor's discretion. Servants who had quietly resisted now awaited her direction openly. Blackwell's presence was reduced to observation. His commands, increasingly ignored, became a hollow echo against the orchestration of the household. Psychologically, Eleanor dismantled him piece by piece. She leveraged every insecurity, every flaw, every public failure. Socially, she spread influence through suggestion and subtle revelation. Neighbors noted that Blackwell's decisions faltered, that his judgment was questioned even before a word was spoken. Inside the estate, every misstep was amplified, every error exposed, every demonstration of weakness magnified. Blackwell's pride, his arrogance, his self-image, the very tools he had relied upon to dominate, became weapons against him. Eleanor, composed and unyielding, allowed the collapse to occur organically, like gravity asserting itself, unavoidable and irreversible. He was trapped in the web of perception, his mind internalizing failure even as he attempted to resist it externally. By the end of that winter, Blackwell was a husk of his former self. He retained his title, his estate, his name, but the authority, the command, the fear he once inspired, had been stripped away entirely. Eleanor had not merely survived, she had conquered. She transformed the estate into a machine of obedience, not through brutality, but through meticulous psychological mastery. Eleanor's victory was both personal and symbolic. She had taken the tools of her oppression, ridicule, neglect, social expectation, and turned them against her oppressor, mastering them as instruments of power. In doing so, she created not just survival, but dominion. Every corridor, every servant, every neighbor now recognized, consciously or not, the shift in hierarchy. The child bride, once a shadow in her own home, now defined the structure of authority. Blackwell's name remained, but Eleanor's will ruled, invisible yet absolute, a testament to the quiet terror and genius of her ascendance. Her revenge was complete, but far more than retribution. It was the transformation of weakness into dominion, of invisibility into empire, of oppression into absolute power. With Blackwell subdued and the household fully under her command, Eleanor Whitmore turned her gaze outward. Power without permanence is fleeting. Dominance limited to walls and corridors is fragile. She understood this instinctively. To ensure her authority endured, she would extend it into the county itself, weaving influence into the very fabric of Ashbourne society. Eleanor began by observing, learning the hierarchies, alliances, and weaknesses of families, merchants, and local officials. She noted every subtle competition, every jealousy, every unspoken fear. Knowledge, she realized, was the most lethal weapon. With precise timing, she planted suggestions, allowed reputations to falter, and nudged disputes toward outcomes that favored her expanding influence. By the time Blackwell realized the extent of her reach, it was already complete. Eleanor controlled not only the estate but the currents of social power in the surrounding county. Servants, once pawns in a domestic game, now became messengers and intermediaries. Eleanor instructed them with subtlety, teaching them that loyalty could be granted strategically, that perception could be manipulated to achieve outcomes far beyond obedience. What outsiders saw as chance encounters, subtle favors, or casual advice were in truth deliberate extensions of her will. The Blackwell estate became the epicenter of influence, its corridors echoing with silent authority. She also manipulated appearances. Public gatherings, fairs, church services, each became a stage for Eleanor to demonstrate competence, composure, and subtle dominance. While Blackwell's name remained on legal documents and social rosters, it was Eleanor's presence, decisions, and discretion that commanded respect and attention. Neighbors and county officials, often unaware of the depth of her orchestration, began to see her as a force, a figure of intellect and authority. The whispers in taverns and parlors shifted. The ghost bride had become the strategist, the unseen mind behind every success and every subtle downfall of Blackwell's influence. Eleanor's consolidation was methodical, unseen, psychological. She leveraged fear, respect, and admiration in precise balance, ensuring her dominion could not be challenged without exposing challengers to social, political, or financial risk. By controlling perception, she controlled reality itself. At the heart of this web stood Blackwell, broken in mind and authority, a living reminder that dominion depends not on size, age, or title, but on strategy, understanding, and patience. Eleanor Whitmore had transformed herself from a victim of circumstance into a master of influence, securing not just survival, but an enduring empire of power over people, perception, and legacy. By winter's end, the county itself had been subtly reshaped, its alliances, its hierarchies, and its whispered judgments all aligned, whether knowingly or not, with Eleanor's design. Her revenge was complete, but her empire was just beginning. Years passed, but Eleanor Whitmore's presence in Ashbybourne was never forgotten. She had transcended the limits imposed upon her as a child bride, transforming humiliation, neglect, and cruelty into a dominion built on intellect, strategy, and absolute control. Blackwell, once a symbol of patriarchal power, remained a figurehead, a hollow man whose authority existed only in name. In reality, every decision, every influence, every whisper of consequence flowed through Eleanor's hand. Her mastery extended beyond the walls of the Blackwell estate. Families once hostile to the Whitmores, merchants seeking favor, officials seeking stability, all found themselves subtly aligned with her will. The county itself had become a stage where Eleanor directed the movements of men and women like pieces on a board, unseen, unchallenged, unstoppable. Fear, respect, and admiration blended into a network that cemented her legacy. Eleanor had learned that real power is not in wealth or title, but in control of perception. Every gesture, every word, every measured action reinforced her dominance. She had internalized the principles of influence, embedding them into the psyche of the county itself. To those who observed casually, she was merely poised, composed, elegant, a woman of refinement. But beneath the surface lay a mind that orchestrated outcomes, anticipated resistance, and manipulated consequences with precision that few could ever comprehend. Her story, though rarely written, carried a lesson. Survival is merely the first step. Mastery comes from understanding the machinery of control, the interplay of fear and respect, the subtleties of human expectation. Eleanor Whitmore had converted the instruments of her oppression, neglect, ridicule, social invisibility, into tools of strategy, reshaping both her life and the world around her. Even after her death, whispers persist. Until neighbors spoke of the ghostly precision of her influence, the way families were guided unknowingly by the echoes of her decisions, the way Blackwell's name remained a cautionary tale. She had become more than a woman wronged. She had become a force embedded in the memory and psyche of Ashbybourne, a symbol of what a single mind, disciplined, observant, and cunning, could achieve against generations of systemic oppression. Eleanor Whitmore's legacy was not vengeance alone. It was transformation. From child bride to widow, from victim to master, She carved a path that rewrote expectations, shattered hierarchies, and permanently altered the landscape of power. In the shadows of Ashbourne, her story endures as a reminder. True dominion is silent, psychological, and enduring. Control is never given. It is seized, cultivated, and executed with relentless precision. And those who underestimated her, like Edmund Blackwell, remain eternal proof that intellect, patience, and strategy will always surpass brute force, age, or assumed authority. Eleanor Whitmore had entered life as a shadow. She left as an empire of influence, invisible, unchallenged, and immortal.